Greetings, magical mavens. Is self-care one of your top priorities for this fall season ahead? The autumn equinox is on the way, and it's the perfect time of year to get grounded, centered, and aligned with our core desires for the final months of the year. The equinox on September 20th is a time of balance when the hours of daylight and the hours of darkness will be equal. In the weeks surrounding it, we can harness the theme of balance in our everyday lives and experience more freedom, flow, and fulfillment. Practicing mindfulness around the beginning of fall helps us to start the process of releasing any physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual baggage that we won't be taking with us into the next year ahead. It also allows us to take notice of and better utilize all of the blessings we've manifested and harvested through the year so far. Virgo season leads right up to the moment of the autumn equinox, a zodiac sign ruled by the divine feminine earth element. Its themes include pausing to take a close look at what is and isn't working, and mindfully organizing our thoughts, patterns, and plans. And of course, Virgo season is also just a time of feathering our nests, doing any necessary fall cleaning to make our inner and outer environment cozy, comfortable, and conducive for an ideal winter season ahead. Autumn is often a time when I find myself most wanting to cozy up with a hot beverage and a good book or podcast about magic, self-care, or personal development. So today, I'm bringing those vibes to you. I invite you to join me and my friend and colleague, Tenae Stewart, aka the Witch of Lupine Hollow, host of the Empowered Modern Witches Summit and author of The Modern Witch's Guide to Natural Magic, for a nourishing conversation about how to get the most out of your self-care practice by tapping into the energies of the sun, moon, and stars, in anticipation of the theme of our summit that's coming up on the autumn equinox. So without further ado, let's cozy up to self-care with the sun, moon, and stars. Welcome back, Tenae, for podcast episode number 4 with you.
Oh my gosh, is it really that many? That's awesome.
So people probably already know you if they've been listening to the podcast. So we're going to dive right into questions that are specifically related to seasons. And I'm super excited to interview you specifically on this because you and me are like soul sisters when it comes to the seasonal obsession. But you have also taught me some things that I wasn't aware of, especially involving astrology. So it'll be fun to kind of get some additional insight for our viewers there. So first things first, super simple question. Do you have a favorite season or Sabbat?
Good question. So, I mean, in terms of season, so every season, like as the new season comes along, my boyfriend Cody always teases me that I'm like, this is my favorite time of year. Like everyone that's here, this is what I like. But I think realistically, like fall is really my favorite season. It's a very short season in California, so we don't get a lot of fall weather. But while it's here, it's just, I don't know, it's like cozy and comforting and just like feels really much like home for me. In terms of a favorite Sabbat, I don't know. I think I answer differently every time someone asks me. I'm partial to Imbolc because I just find it like kind of a similar vibe, you know. It has that just like very cozy, comforting, very grounded kind of energy. But you know, I mean, I love the holidays. I love Samhain, I love Yule, and I love all of them. Who am I kidding?
Yeah, it's hard when you're like a seasonal witch to even narrow it down because we understand that the whole cycle is necessary and it each has its own little gifts. But yeah, Mabon is probably my favorite too. And thanks to learning from you, I now know that it's because that is my personal summer, which we will get into for anyone who's curious. But yeah, what inspires you most about working with the Wheel of the Year? I know there's so many aspects of it that you do and that you teach on, but is there like one part of it that like maybe drew you in at the beginning and just keeps you interested?
Yeah, I mean, I think what really drew me even to my witchcraft and spiritual practice in general was the seasons and the moon, but definitely the seasons. And I think when I really learned that there was this whole practice of celebrating the seasons with a spiritual perspective, like that just was so appealing to me. Because even when I was a kid, I really was just so drawn to celebrating the seasons. And, we would always like decorate our house when I was growing up for the different seasons and things like that. But it was more than that. It was even just being aware of those really subtle shifts. And I think part of that does come from the fact that summer is very long in California, and fall is very short. And so like the anticipation of fall, even as a kid, I think was very meaningful, like noticing the little ways that fall was starting to appear, that other people might not even notice, like, oh, it's still so hot, like it doesn't feel like fall, but starting to notice those little details. And that's definitely still such an important part of my practice, is just an awareness of those little shifts. Maybe partly because they are subtle in California. We don't have really dramatic seasons. And they even seem a little like off to, especially to people who aren't from here, like things are green in December. And it's like, yeah, it's finally green again because there's finally rain. So, it's kind of funny. Like it's not necessarily what people expect it to be. But I think tuning into that and noticing that there are seasons, there are subtle shifts and changes, that are reflected in ourselves as well, I think is still something that drew me in, and is still something that's really important to me.
Yeah, I love that. And I love your perspective on seasons living in California. I'm guessing for most or all of your life, right? Because like I have lived in New York for pretty much all of my life, and not just all parts of New York, but literally Western New York, which is the lake effect snow region. So we get like extreme summer, extreme fall, extreme everything. And so I've always wondered, like, would my perspective of seasons like change dramatically if I went and lived somewhere like California? Would I even have the same spiritual beliefs anymore? Like these are real questions. So, yeah, I love that you are able to really be so inspired and drawn into this, even in a place where people who don't pay attention don't even realize that there are seasons?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think like often people in California will kind of complain about that, that it's like, oh, fall's like 4 weeks if we're lucky. Like, it can be in the 80s and 90s in October sometimes. So I think being able to notice that and notice that, like, yeah, okay, it is still really hot and like it's not my favorite, but the leaves are changing colors, the trees are shifting, like the plants are looking different. Like just yesterday we were driving around running some errands, and I was noticing there's lots of agapanthus in California, which is like a purple flower, and it's people plant it in their yards and stuff. It's really popular. And like maybe last week I had noticed it was everywhere. It was in full bloom. And it's one of those, like, it kind of blooms all summer. Like you don't really notice it that much. But for some reason, I noticed like it was really, really pretty last week. And then yesterday, when we were out driving around, I noticed everywhere we went, the agapanthus was like just starting to wilt. And it was so interesting, just those like small little things that when you really pay attention and you really notice them, they do tell you what's happening and what's shifting energetically, even if it is subtle and even if it is totally different. If you live in like a tropical climate, or if you live somewhere where winter is really, really long, like you're going to have a different experience of the seasons. And it's less about like having this perfect example of, every season being 3 months long, and more about what do the seasons actually look like where you are.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if I've ever asked you this before, maybe, but when did you first discover the Wheel of the Year, and what was your sort of story of, stepping into that?
Yeah. Well, so Lamass was the first one that I ever celebrated, not really intentionally. It was just the next coming up when I decided I wanted to start. But it definitely like has a special place for me because of that. And I know that I was really interested in like magic and Wicca and like all of these themes and ideas, even in like middle school and high school. But I think that I officially started practicing when I was about 18. which I was already in college at that point, which seems kind of crazy to me because I know that I was really, really into it in several years prior to that. So maybe it's farther back than I think it is, but that's when I remember specifically really starting to practice. And I'm not really sure what was finally the catalyst of like, okay, this isn't something that I'm just reading about. Like, this is something that I actually want to do for myself. I don't know when that shift happened. Maybe it was so subtle that I didn't even really realize that it had changed. But yeah, it was definitely one of the first things that I learned about related to Wicca and witchcraft and magic, was definitely the seasons and working with the full moons. Back then, I even really wasn't working with the new moon. But the wheel of the year and the full moons were definitely the first things that I worked with and celebrated in my practice.
And that leads me into another question, which is, do you, and I know the answer to this, but some of our listeners might not, but like, do you slash how do you work with moons in relation to the seasons? Because I feel like when I first started, I actually first started with the moon. I read this book called Red Moon by Miranda Gray, which is about the menstrual cycle and the moon. And I was like, wow, this is so cool. And, you know, when you first start getting into paganism, the moon is often the first thing you kind of hear about, and there's moon symbols everywhere, right? But then I found the Wheel of the Year, and that was my kick for a while. And I kind of stopped paying as much attention to the moons. And so it's really kind of just now, actually, after many years of kind of doing one or the other, that especially like working with you, where you do both, I'm like, okay, so I can do these together. So when did you sort of discover that they work together? And like, how do you sort of maneuver between the two?
Yeah, one of my favorite topics, as you know. So I'd worked with the Wheel of the Year and with the moon phases for years, on and off, kind of the same, but for many years. And I don't know, it was a few years ago, several years ago now. And at some point, I was working with kind of all three cycles. I was working with seasons, I was working with the moon, and I was working with astrology. And the one thing that I do remember is like my practice and my work has evolved so much, and you don't always know, like, can I pinpoint when this happened? But one thing I do remember is when I first started working with the new and full moons in a particular sign. Like when I was younger, that was never part of it. It was just, it's the full moon. And I didn't even really connect astrology to it at all. But when I started doing that, I initially was very lost. I was like, okay, I understand the energy of like the new moon in Scorpio is going to be different than the new moon in Capricorn, right? Like that made sense to me. But what I wasn't finding the thread is it seemed random initially, right? So it would be like, okay, you know, we had like the new moon in Capricorn, and then the full moon in, I'm going to get these wrong, the full moon in Gemini, and then the new moon in Aquarius. And I'm like, what the heck? Like, how are these? What makes it be in a sign? And so then I started doing research, and I started learning like, okay, what does the moon phases actually have to do with astrology? And I realized that it's actually not random at all when you actually know what you're looking at. And what we have is every month we have the new moon in the same sign as the sun and the full moon in the opposite sign as the sun. And each sign has a natural opposite. And so we would have the new moon in Capricorn, for example, and then the sun, actually, I had that backwards, didn't I? The sun would move from Sagittarius into Capricorn. So we'd have like the full moon in Gemini because Gemini and Sagittarius are opposites. And then the sun would move into Capricorn and we'd have the new moon in Capricorn. And so, although it kind of seems random when you're looking to like the full moon in one month and the new moon in the next month, they're actually very cyclical and very, very predictable. And so then what I realized is that the seasons are connected to this too, because for a while I was working with like lunar astrology in that sense of, okay, the new and full moons and the quarter moons too are in particular signs every month. It's all interrelated. But the Wheel of the Year felt like this other thing. It felt like this totally separate like belief system and cycle and idea, until I realized that it actually interconnected too. And it actually, I think, made the Wheel of the Year like much more, I don't know, I want to say relevant. I don't know if that's the word I mean, but like much more relevant for me at that time in my life, where I was feeling more called, like you said, kind of pulled between the two. I was feeling more called to the moon and to the planets. but I didn't want to abandon the wheel of the year. Like it's still such an important part of my life. And so when I realized they all fit together, I was like completely blown, because I realized all these things that I'd been working with for years as distinct, separate ideas actually all go together. So the way that it works is that we have the solstices and equinoxes and the fire festivals all happen when the sun is in particular signs. So, for example, the spring equinox always happens in the northern hemisphere when the sun enters Aries. In the southern hemisphere, it's when it enters Libra, because Aries and Libra are opposites. So in the northern hemisphere, the sun moves into Aries. It's the beginning of the zodiac. We have the spring equinox. And then we always have the new moon in Aries and the full moon in Libra close to the spring equinox. And that's true of all of the festivals in the wheel of the year, is they're within a couple weeks of a particular new moon, a particular full moon. They always happen when the sun's in a particular sign. And when I realized that, for one thing, I just felt like it made all of these different disparate ideas so much simpler, that I was like, oh my God, why is no one talking about this? And then, I like went and wrote a book about it, because I was like, nobody's written this book. It's so helpful. Because it was so helpful for me. So I don't know, did that answer your question?
Yes, it does. And I can imagine your brain exploding when you realize that, because that's how I felt. I was just like, oh my gosh, why isn't anyone talking about this? It's like, it's right there glaring us all in the face, but we're not paying attention. So yeah, that's so much more helpful. So yeah, but how do you actually work with them? So would you, because I know you consider yourself a cottage witch, so would you kind of marry together the theme of the season and the moon phase and the moon sign with like, whatever magic you're doing and your sort of hearth and home practices, or like, how does that actually work in a tangible way?
Yeah. So a lot of my practice with the season, so I kind of consider the festivals in the wheel of the year and the astrological sign that they go with, to be kind of like a season in and of themselves, right? So, like, for example, Lammas in the northern hemisphere always happens during Leo season. So Lammas and Leo, like, they have these kind of common themes. They're all kind of tied up together. And yes, Lammas is technically August 1st. But it's really an entire season, right? Because centuries old, like it's not that relevant. So you can celebrate these festivals at the new moon, at the full moon, for the entire season. And so I mostly, the way I celebrate the wheel of the year is some of them through kind of decorating my house, right? Like decorate for fall, I decorate for winter, sometimes a little bit for spring, not so much for summer, but at least I'll like clean the house and stuff for the new season. And so kind of getting the space feeling aligned with that energy. And then up through food for sure, right? So I'll be cooking certain things, or my boyfriend's mom does a lot of amazing canning. So we'll like be eating certain foods, opening certain preserves and things like that in certain seasons. So that, it is very like cozy, homey, just like things in our everyday lives that are shifting to align with that current energy. And then a lot of it is just, noticing the changes happening in the yard and the trees around our house, in, the town where we live, like just noticing that the leaves are changing on the trees, or, there's like these beautiful little cherry trees by my office. And in the spring, they're like hot pink. They're so beautiful. And just noticing that, and then noticing when they're green too, that like, they're not as dramatic, but that's what they look like in summer. So a lot of it is just kind of like awareness and mindfulness and aligning with that energy. I'll drink like seasonal teas, and, I might have certain essential oils in my diffuser, things like that. And then with the new and full moons, so the new moon, it kind of goes along with that whole little package, that little bundle, right? Like, because it's in the same sign. So Lammas, Leo season, the new moon in Leo, right? They all kind of go together. Then there's the full moon. And what I love about the full moon is that it's always in the opposite sign, which gives us this dose of opposite energy, this dose of perspective. So, if we've got like all this Leo energy going on, for example, at Lamaze season, then the full moon in Aquarius comes along to like balance that out, to give us a different way of thinking, a different way of looking at it. And the full moon has really always been my favorite phase. I'm partial to a lot of them, but I love the full moon. And I love that it has that opposite effect, right? I find that it's can almost be very grounding in a way, because it helps us to like be a whole person, right? We don't just get lost in this one particular energy. We're reminded that there's other things as well. So a lot of that for me is, like I might pull cards or do some journaling, light some candles. Like my full moon ritual doesn't look vastly different from sign to sign. But I might be asking different questions when I'm pulling cards, or, reflecting on something specific to that opposite sign that it is in.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I remember first discovering, probably on your podcast, actually, that the full moon is always in the opposite sign as whatever sign the sun is in. And I was like, I've always kind of heard that, but never like fully understood it in the context of like my language, which is like seasons and elements and stuff like that. Well, maybe I understood it in the concept of elements, but not so much like modalities, right? Like in astrology, we have these different modalities where they have to do with the seasons too, which we don't have to go into because our last episode went super in depth on that. I will link that for anyone who's curious. But you did mention your boyfriend and his mom. So I'm wondering, do you practice like your seasonal and Sabbat celebrations totally solitary? Do you partially include other people, or do you like full blown include everybody that you know? Because I know
that's a great question. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I would say from like the spiritual side, like it's really more solitary. That I will pull cards and things like that often. Like, and this took some getting used to when we first moved in together, but often like I will do my rituals like with Cody in the room, mostly because like, well, and it may be a little bit different this fall. We'll see. We had a roommate and she recently moved out, or she moved out at the beginning of this year. So it'll be interesting, like how that shifts the dynamic. Cause sometimes now there's another room. So sometimes he goes in the other room, but there was a good chunk of time where we had one room that we shared that was our personal space. And it's a good size room, thankfully. But, I have like my altar on one side of the room with a chair and some, lamp and things like that. And so I had to like kind of get okay with that, okay, I don't live by myself anymore. Like I have to kind of, if I want to do my rituals, if I want them to happen, like someone else might be in the room. And I think that was actually really good for me because I think it did help me get like so much more comfortable in like who I am and what I do. And, even though Cody knew what I do, like, but it was different to like actually have him there and present, even if, he's watching TV or whatever. So the spiritual side is like primarily solitary, but not necessarily, like have the house to myself solitary. But yeah, I mean, the seasonal celebration, I think, is really just kind of very present in our house. Like we have lots of big windows that look out on the yard. So like nature is just really, really close to our house. And it just feels like part of the house and part of the property, which is really special. So it's just kind of natural, it's like I decorate the house for the different seasons. That's just kind of present and kind of there. Cooking certain things, everybody's gonna partake. So yeah, I would say it's like partially, right? Like kind of the more seasonal stuff is kind of more shared. And the spiritual side is more personal.
I love that. And I think I'd have to agree. Being out of the broom closet as I am, people kind of know that like I'm obsessed with seasons and that it's part of my spiritual practice and that I decorate and whatnot. But when it's time to do like a serious ritual, I need like to be alone. And I don't currently live with a partner. And the last time I did, it was someone who like could be there for the fun parts, but couldn't really be there for the serious parts because he was just a distraction. But my current partner is very spiritual, not really in like the traditional witchy sense. That part's kind of more new for him, but he can easily get into the rituals and whatnot. But like for me, I'm just getting used to it, because I'm so used to being totally solitary. And It is, you're right. It is very good for your sort of, I don't know if confidence is the word, but I don't know, like your identity, I guess, to be like, this is me with or without someone else in the room, take it or leave it, and it helps when it's the right person who's not going to like make fun of you or be distracting. But yeah, it's a deepening level of your practice when someone can be there for even like the really ritualistic, solitary part. So Dumbledore claps.
Yeah, I totally agree. I totally agree. And I think that's definitely something that, a few years ago, like I would have been like, oh my gosh, I could never do that. But yeah, when it's the right person, and even if, because like same, like Cody, can kind of get into it, kind of understand it, but it's really not his thing. And he has like spirituality in a different way. And so I don't know, he just like he respects it. It's always been an open thing with us. And yeah, and that was very different than prior relationships for me. So yeah, it is. I think it's a special thing to be able to share, even if you don't share it on that deep level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like maybe we've talked about this a little bit, like not in a recorded form, but I would love to get some further insight. So, for me, one of my favorite things about the Wheel of the Year is that plant tend harvest compost cycle, as I like to call it, of manifestation. And like for me, realizing that like all of the planets and the earth and, life cycles of humans and animals and plants all kind of follow that same pattern, just, on different scales, that kind of became my obsession, like manifestation through this cycle. And even now that, like in human design, I've discovered that I'm a non-specific manifester, which has completely changed like the way I try to manifest things. I'm much more, in that sort of receptive feminine mode. And then when I do get into masculine mode, it's less about trying to control things and more so just about taking inspired action, but I'm still just kind of navigating what that looks like for me. And so I'm curious, what is your experience with using the cycles for manifestation? Like, is that something you do in more of a direct way, or is it kind of just like, again, that sort of awareness?
Yeah. I think one of the ways I definitely use it is with the new and full moons in the same signs. And this is something I've done for years, and I think is one of my favorite parts of my own practice that has just had such an impact on me is theoretically, although I always fall off in the summer because it is my personal winter. So we'll be getting back to it soon as fall comes around. But theoretically, my new and full moon rituals every month, I write down at least a page, right? Sometimes a lot more than that, but at least a page in a particular notebook, particular grimoire that I use just for that. And I'll write down, the day of the lunation and what sign it was in, what that means, and what I did for my ritual, cards I pulled, things like that. And one of the things that I will often do is I'll flip back through that journal, or there are many, many volumes because I've been doing this for years and I have them all kind of in one section at my altar. Is I'll flip back and I'll find like if let's say it's the full moon in Gemini, right? So I would look back to the new moon in Gemini, which would have been about 6 months earlier, and see what did I do for my ritual? What cards did I pull? What was I thinking about? What was I working on? And just that reflection, that 6 month reflection, kind of immersed in that same energy is super, super powerful. That has been really huge for manifesting for me because 6 months is a really good chunk of time to see whether you've made progress towards something or not, or if your desires have changed, or if something has shifted so much that you couldn't have imagined what that would have looked like. And so being able to look back, and often it's just like a couple sentences that I'll write down and reflect on it, but being able to do that and look at that 6 month cycle throughout the year with each set of new and full moons, it's definitely been powerful for manifesting because it gives you that opportunity to reflect, to change or shift or release something. And also to celebrate your wins and see like, oh my God, I've created so much in the last 6 months.
Yeah, I love that. And that really brings the lunar aspect sort of back into it because The moon cycle is, I think, much more tangible to understand for manifesting because we can clearly see that like 4 steps in the process in a short period of time. Whereas with the seasons, we can easily kind of just get carried away and like forget what the point of it is because it's such a long time and you can kind of get distracted. So, yeah, I love that. And we did touch upon, but not get into earlier, personal seasons. And I don't think we like super got into that in the last episode either. So I would love to know, because I do have a question that I ask everyone, which is like, do you resonate with the sort of traditional themes of the seasons? And I know that you kind of do, but kind of don't. And I know part of that is due to astrology. So, like, if you could quickly brief our audience on what personal seasons are and then kind of tell us how you relate to them in your own practice, that would be so awesome.
Yeah. So personal seasons is this kind of theory that I came up with several years ago. When I realized, so a natural quote unquote chart has Aries in the first house. Okay. So if you're looking at the wheel of the chart, Aries is in the first chart over on the left-hand side. And then each sign is in each house all the way around. And that puts every sign in its natural house. Aries, as I mentioned earlier, is when the spring equinox happens. So theoretically, in a natural chart, spring equinox is at 0 degrees of Aries and of the first house. And so I realized that the 12th house, which is Pisces traditionally, is the transition from winter into spring. And, it's like it has that very like anticipatory kind of energy, but it's also still like very winter, right? It's like that Groundhog Day, like, is it over yet energy. And so I realized that I always felt that kind of energy during Leo season in the summer, with Virgo being my first house. And as soon as the sun moves into Virgo, I just feel so much more myself. I feel like so much more energized again. I have so much more energy, so much more focus. And so I developed this kind of idea that the chart is divided into 4 quadrants, 4 seasons. And regardless of what signs you have in each of those, that your rising sign is basically your own personal spring equinox. And those next couple of houses are your personal spring, and then kind of moves through the chart, right? When it moves into your 4th house, that becomes your personal summer, and so on. And I knew it really resonated for me. And then I started sharing it, and it resonates so much for so many of my clients and friends, that, it's definitely not a universal truth, but I find it can be really, really helpful for so many of us whose charts may not be aligned really closely with the natural seasons. And so for me, it's with Virgo rising, it's that like back to school energy of like, this is my new year, right? This is when things feel like, okay, we're starting new things, we're getting projects going. Like, that's when I have that kind of energy. And then your personal summer is often, for me, it's over the holidays. It's often like this very celebratory, like it's both very active and outgoing, and also when you kind of want to take time off so you can do stuff you love, right? Then your personal fall is kind of more intuitive, starting to turn within, and your personal winter is the top left part of the chart, which is the 10th to 12th houses. And that tends to be like your lowest energy, most restful time, which for me happens to be the dead of summer.
Yeah, that is so interesting because ever since I started working with and teaching with the seasons, I have always had like a client or someone who is like, I am totally the opposite. Usually they'll say it's like, for example, I had a client who lives in Texas and she said that summer is her personal winter because it's so hot. But now I'm wondering, maybe it also has to do with her astrology. I'll have to ask because she's coming on the podcast. So we'll see. But yeah, like I discovered through your content that like my seasons are similar to the normal seasons, but slightly delayed because my rising sign is Gemini. So that makes so much sense in the way that like I feel like the natural seasons make sense, but I'm kind of slow and slightly delayed to get into it. Like on the spring equinox, I'm not having like a big like change out of my wardrobe. And I know part of this is because of where I live, where it might still be a blizzard, but It's also just because I'm not ready to start going to like parties and, come out of my cocoon yet. I'm still introverted like I would be in the winter. And then when Beltane comes, then it's like, all right, now it's on. Now it's spring. And speaking of seasons, as we're closing out here, I know that I'm really excited and you're probably really excited. And hopefully people listening who were around for it last year are very excited. But we're having the third annual Empowered Modern Witches Summit. And I'm wondering, and you can kind of introduce people to it a little bit as well in answering this question, but I'm wondering why you selected autumn equinox every year. Is it because it's your sort of personal spring and you have the energy for it? Is it because witchy stuff, is common in the fall for new people? Like they're just naturally kind of, attracted to it during that time, or like, what was your sort of intention behind it being at the autumn equinox?
Yeah. So third annual, it's going to be amazing this year. It's the week of September 19th this year. And is actually a totally practical reason originally is the first summit in 2020 was basically the virtual launch for my first book, The Modern Witch's Guide to Magical Self-Care, which came out first week of October that year. And, we were like height of lockdowns. I couldn't do any kind of book events. And so I came up with this idea to do a virtual summit. And so it was just really designed to align with, okay, the book comes out in, a week or two. But then it kind of fell into place so perfectly. And we've just kept it that week every year because it's so perfect for kind of like heralding the witches season. It's perfect for my energy. It's just such a fun week. So we have over 15 speakers this year, some live, some pre-recorded. We're also going to have some panel discussions, which is new this year. And everyone's going to be talking about all of these topics. So all sorts of ways to practice self-care through witchcraft, through the seasons, the moon, through astrology. I'm going to be doing 2 workshops this year. It's going to be super fun.
Yeah, and I'm so excited to be a part of it too, because just like it's your personal spring, it's my personal summer, and like I love autumn equinox. Yeah, if anyone is interested in learning more about anything we talked about today, we definitely invite you guys to come to the summit. It's totally free, but there's some really amazing bonuses if you guys decide to do the VIP version. You get what is it, thousands of dollars worth of bonuses?
Basically, yeah, I don't have the total yet, but I think it's going to be probably close to $1,000 for $77 ticket. You get lifetime access to the replays. You're going to get a live class with me and access to my signature course. And then, it's like $1,000 in bonuses from all of the speakers. So really good stuff.
Yay! Well, thank you so much, Tenae. This has been awesome. Thank you for coming back a 4th time and gracing us with your magical witchiness. And I will see you next time.
Thanks so much for having me.
The Empowered Modern Witches Summit is our live virtual event taking place on September 19th to 23rd, 2022, the week of the autumn equinox in the Northern Hemisphere. The perfect time for gathering, sharing wisdom and gratitude, and breaking virtual bread together. It's totally free to attend and features an incredible lineup of witches, astrologers, and authors, myself included. And all of us will be sharing our diverse perspectives on how you can use the seasons, moon phases, astrology, and magic for your overall wellness and self-care. I'll be presenting on harnessing the autumn themes to create sacred space at home and in everyday mundane life. Other people's presentation topics include spiritual bathing, sex magic, secular witchcraft, finding your center through lunar guidance, pillars of self-care and creating self-care rituals with your astrological chart, using the moon as a tool of transformation, mothering yourself back to wholeness with your moon sign, healing money trauma and activating your abundance frequency, astrological empowerment and shadow work with Black Moon Lilith, a healing activation to reclaim your magic, and so much more. I'll also be participating in a live panel discussion about self-care for the autumn season, and there will be 2 other panel discussions on shadow work and living your most magical life. So to get your free ticket, we invite you to go to witchoflupinehollow.com/summit-2022-speakers. See you there.